So we are still in the COVID spotlight, and I've again split it into multiple podcasts, so hopefully you have continuity there. So we're looking at the stimulus funds, and so this is the topic: developing a stimulus and recovery package that builds resilience. So we were worrying about irreversible environmental impacts or lock-in to risky or carbon intensive patterns, and we looked at this example of how different categories of interventions perform along different dimensions when you look at score weighted for short-term growth, long-term growth, resilience, and decarbonization, and the various sectors considered here. So we are looking now at this figure P.41, which demonstrates how each sectoral group performed against each category for the 63 remaining interventions. As expected, they were all strong on resilience, which is what I mentioned in the last podcast here, the gray area. This was, after all, a resilience plan, but they also performed well on long-term growth. This was to be expected since the plan was developed to support long-term sustainable growth. So the orange line is pretty significant in each of these interventions planned, and this was to be expected also since the plan was to support long-term sustainable growth. Short-term growth was more selective, but since the worst measures were removed during initial screening, the 63 remaining actions provided some short-term stimulus benefits. The decarbonization dimensions produced most different results across sectors, with only energy and agriculture interventions generating significant benefits in this domain. So here is agriculture with a bit of decarbonization. Energy has much bigger one. This is almost the same in terms of the total environment, however that was measured. To package these measures into a suitable stimulus plan, a budget cutoff was applied at 3% GDP, reducing the list to 10 core interventions, which we'll look at in table 4.1. As expected, they will perform well against the 4 core categories. In particular, they are expected to boost long-term productivity and growth by improving agricultural productivity or the reliability of infrastructure, or by reducing energy use or wastewater. Some, but not all of them, also contribute to decarbonization. So the main thing to remember here when we talk about percentage of GDP is that instead of deciding actual number in terms of the amount to be invested, it's always more long-term benefit. It's always better to lock it as a percentage of GDP, so that the funding may go up and down as the GDP goes up and down, which is fair, but it always sets aside a fraction of the GDP for these kinds of plans. Okay, so table 4.1 here, budget cutoff analysis of interventions in Fiji's climate vulnerability analysis. Intervention title, category, cost in Fijian dollars in millions, and short-term, long-term resilience and decarbonization. So let's just run through them to make sure we are aware of the details here as well. So here they were top 10%, middle 10 to 90%, bottom 10%, and decarbonization interventions with 0% are these white spots here. So what are the intervention titles? Improving resilience of rural mini-grid and solar home systems. Fits in energy with some cost, had some decarbonization impact as well. I won't go through the details of top 10% and all these. So scores used here for illustrative purposes as well as we did before. Short term gets 1, long term gets 0.5, resilience gets 0.5 as well, and so does decarbonization. You can read the original paper to get a better handle on that. So sustainable agricultural practices, housing microfinance with 5-year loans to retrofit existing houses and construct new houses to approved designs and standards. Shows some good planning there as well in terms of interventions. Community level investments for improved ecosystem resilience phase 1, diversifying renewable energy generation, expanding underground distribution lines, progressive structural upgrading of all remaining schools and health facilities not affected by Tropical Cyclone Winston in phase 1. So this shows future planning where even those that were not directly affected were being helped for health and education. Expanding solar generation, so that gets a high investment need, as well as expanding underground distribution lines at $90 Fijian million. Promoting alternative income sources not dependent on fisheries. So this is under social protection and gets 10 million estimate. Doesn't do much for decarbonization, but has impacts on top 10% and middle 10 to 90% in terms of the various impacts of the investment we are looking at. Finally, reduction of physical water losses, 50 million in investment, and bottom 10% here, middle and top for the long term, and resilience and some decarbonization in the top 10% as well. So let's read this then and finish it off. Okay, so we read the before table. Now conclusion of this story. This exercise does not pretend to identify the best stimulus package for Fiji. Designing a stimulus package would require further exploration of options and interventions that are not a part of the CBA resilience plan. For example, the tourism sector is heavily affected by COVID-19, and identifying measures that target this sector will be crucial. Sri Lanka went almost bankrupt, did go bankrupt because of the loss of tourism, combined with some not so smart planning they did on switching to 100% organic farming and so on. So COVID has had some devastating effects across many regions and countries. Direct cash transfers or public work programs targeting the unemployed and the poorest are also a cornerstone of a stimulus program. Finally, the weights used to produce interventions need to reflect the priorities of both government and population, instead of being fixed arbitrarily as they were here for illustrative purposes. But this exercise shows how governments can use existing investment plans as an input into a stimulus program design, if properly screened, to ensure selected interventions are appropriate in the current context. It also demonstrates how a simple tool that allows governments to discard measures that are inappropriate today and prioritize others based on simple weights can support the design of a recovery plan. Okay, so decision making is critical, and how the information is supplied and made useful, usable, actionable is very critical. Using existing development plans as an initial menu of options for screening has its advantages. It would ensure that selected interventions meet short-term needs by immediately creating appropriate jobs. At the same time, the fact that all considered measures were already included in long-term plans, whether national development plans, nationally determined contributions, or resilience plans, would ensure that stimulus package generates long-term benefits that go beyond immediate needs. Well, this was published in 2020, but as of 2023 June end, there are many lessons to be learned from COVID experience. Okay, so let me maybe make another podcast with this long text. As I said, during STEM courses, typically you don't have so much text. You have figures, you have dynamics, you have physics, feedbacks, and so on. But in social sciences like adaptation, unfortunately, we have to go through a lot of text, which becomes necessary because, as I said before, the problem definition is in description and discursive descriptions, and the solutions and methodologies are also descriptive and discursive. So we have to just live with it. Okay, so let me leave this podcast, which is only 9 or 10 minutes, well, basically less than 10 minutes long, but that's okay. We'll have one short podcast, and the next one will be relatively of similar length, so that we can digest it properly. Okay,